Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining. My name is Karim Masloud. I'm the Manager of International Projects at Premier Corex, and I'll be hosting this session. Today, this session is Keeping It Correct, the Art of Core Preparation, and it's delivered by our very own Leigh Wright. Leigh is a Business Development and Technical Advisor based in Aberdeen, Scotland. I hope you enjoy the session. If this is the first time for you attending, we're happy to have you. If you have been on one of our sessions before, thank you for coming back, and we hope that you'll find this valuable. Okay. Just a few quick rules before we start. Okay. If you have any questions, please submit those through the Q&A panel. Okay. We will address your questions toward the end of the session. The session should run for about 45 minutes, allowing about 15 minutes for Q&A at the end. All the attendees are audio is being muted, so please ask any questions of the Q&A section, as I said. And the session is being recorded. At the end of the session, you will receive a copy of the recording for your reference. Okay. Thank you very much for joining, and I'll turn over to Leigh.
Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everyone. Just a brief background into myself. Thank you very much, Karim, for introducing today's webinar, the second in the series. I've been at Premier Corex, based in Aberdeen now for 11 years. My background in the oil and gas industry is information damage. I've co-authored several papers with the North Sea, UAE and Oman. Looked after over 100 formation damage projects worldwide, covering most of the major basins around the world. And my background in education is in geology and petroleum geology from Aberdeen University, and an MSc in petroleum geochemistry from the University of Newcastle. So today we're going to do a very brief overview on a very large topic, and that is core preparation, keeping it correct. Core preparation is the most important part to start an excellent project. If you don't get the core preparation correct at the beginning, then the outputs of any study will be potentially questionable. The major point what we're going to go through, apart from the preparation is important, is planning in advance, making sure that the preparation is done correctly. There's to be some advantages and challenges to walk through, and also at the end, just a quick summary and conclusion, and along with the Q&A at the end. So, core preparation. We're going to talk mainly here about reservoir core material. There are analog options for doing studies in formation damage, for example, but the main purpose is to talk on looking after reservoir core. Now, there's several different stages of preparation. There's obviously well site preservation, the transportation of the core, making sure the core doesn't get damaged whilst being transported from well site. That can involve shipping, plane, vans, lorries. We've got laboratory testing, what's required, and then also looking after core for future. And this is something that we've experienced quite a lot, Premier Corex, over the 40, 50 years. I myself have had to drive our van to a CT scanner with frozen core in the back with shock absorbers, and that driving at 20 miles an hour in Aberdeen's roads, watching out for the potholes is quite dangerous. So even transporting core to a hospital with friable core can be extremely difficult. Our major thing that we see now, especially with the legacy wells in the UK North Sea and Norwegian North Sea, we end up doing testing that's maybe not been planned when the core was taken decades ago. So now we're getting into CCUS and enhanced oil recovery. Sometimes it's very difficult to find core material, representative core material, for projects that the carbon capture would never have been thought of at the time when the original core was taken, and that includes different areas where you're looking at cap rocks and shale and fissile material. So all of these have to be taken into consideration for lessons learned and also moving forward in future for lab testing that we're now proceeding with. So, like I said, the importance of core preparation, why taking the core is important. It's quality and accuracy of data output. If you don't get the preparation correct at the beginning, you don't use the inputs or understand what information you're going to be needing throughout a project, you might end up disrupting the critical path of the project lifecycle. So I'll talk a little bit about that later on, but not having a fully planned program at the beginning can add months onto a project. And if you have a tight deadline where you need the data to start getting the rig on site, etc., then that can cause an issue. Future project applications, I've mentioned that already in terms of potential CCUS projects. Information damage, for example, if a new operator or partner has taken over the well and wants to go in to reevaluate some of the potential fluids being used for drilling, you might need to check, you might have had a scaling issue downhole, you need to check the scale inhibitors or do some acid flushing for re-stimulation. You need to make sure that you've planned in advance to make sure that you have a representative core material in the future. Historical knowledge, if you know that the processes that have been done in the past are legitimate and are correct, then you can look back over previous data that's potentially a field that you've not owned in the past. Therefore, that you know that the preparation has been done correctly and you have a high confidence in the level of the data that you're getting or you're rereading from previous reports. Then also it's a repeatability of laboratory testing as well. So if you need to go back and retest something, there's a formulation that needs to be rechecked, or you want to check data that's maybe been done by a redundant lab and you need to recheck the data to make sure that you've got confidence, then having the core material prepared correctly and understanding the parameters is, again, extremely important. So planning in advance, and we'll talk mostly today about the importance of having a lot of the different applications combined together. But as you can see from the slide, core layout and marking is important to get that right at the beginning, so then the orientation is not going to be correct. That's the first step of getting it correct. We'll talk a lot about CT scanning today and why that's important, gamma ray logging, and then we won't talk about gamma ray logging today, but core plugging, the plugging systems, the difference between horizontal, vertical plugs. We'll talk a little bit about unconsolidated plugs, and a bit about the photography as well. But as you can see on the right-hand side of the screen, we've got a basic core processing overview. You have to make sure that the core is handled correctly at the beginning, receipt of the core. I mean, even handling the core at the beginning and making sure you have experience in removing the core from the barrel, laying it out, making sure that you've got an understanding of the future programs that might be used. And we've listed there SCAL, you've got reservoir geology, the petrography, you've got formation damage, rock mechanics. And then there's also the understanding that you may need to preserve sections as well. And that we'll talk a little bit later on in FD with the CT scanning as well. So understanding the future applications of cutting core is important. Defining the core programs early, understanding. As you can see on the diagrams at the side, we've got some laid out core in a very nice drawn diagram. And you've got different areas of the core where you'll be taking different samples for the different applications. Obviously, in the diagram at the bottom, the ideal area is to take core not from the periphery of the sample to avoid any potential invaded zones. Any of the coring fluid might get into the near wellbore areas. So you want to avoid having that in the sample because that's going to mess up logs. And also, you're not going to get the true data from the material that you're getting because it's been damaged already, initial formation damage from coring. I think when you're looking at this as well, you've got to get your petrophysicists and geologists to decide which areas may be preserved for future analysis. That's an extremely common thing for formation damage, again, which we'll mention later on, is taking the preserved samples, identifying the zones that might be earmarked for testing, and also very important to remember to take in clean trims and carcasses as well. This is an issue that we have regularly when it comes to conventional core versus sidewall cores, which is a nod back to Jules's first webinar to start the series. With conventional core, trims and carcass material for destructive tests is extremely important to make sure that you're getting representative material from that for the destructive tests. For sidewall cores, you have to leave the destructive tests till the end if no suitable trim material has been taken. And we'll talk a little bit about the necessity for diameters for the scal and rock mechanic testing. So you would only be able to trim the sample towards the end of the testing to get the material for destructive testing. So like CEC, MICP, SEM, dry or cryogenic for that matter. So always remember trims and carcass. So yeah, we're talking here again about the evolution of CT scanning. It's key in terms of getting that first initial preparation stage correct in terms of identifying areas where you're going to take plugs. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see a CT scan that was taken in 2015 of a preserved sample. Now, in the pilot scan here, you can see where cross sections have been taken. I've left them out of the slide, but you can see that there's features throughout the sample. But when you're looking at the slice through here, you've got saltire, which is a nod to Scotland, but unfortunately it's not suitable. It's masking the bedding and small features. You can see higher density areas where the colors flipped here, but you're having to rely on having visual eyeballs on the sample when the sample's opened and looked at in there, because you can't see any fabric really to a high level to look into the plugging zones. Whereas you can see a more recent scan from 2024. Again, it's a preserved sample. These are the same length. And you can see this small, shaly, more clay-rich zones, a more homogeneous zone here, where you can then identify the bedding. In terms of formation damage and the scal, making sure that they're getting the best path of flow, it's extremely important. I mean, when you get these CT scans, you can look through them in 2D and 3D and see the different zones. But you can also see the importance of having a CT scan here. You can see a very not well preserved section on screen, the top right, where it's a bit rubbly. So it's kind of spoils Christmas when you do a CT scan prior to opening it. But again, it's good to understand what's inside the preserved sample. So obviously, getting suitable samples from this section was not achievable. To a sense, we did manage to do some work with that section, but we then had a small delay in the project timeline, which again is a really important aspect of this talk today, is that we did the CT scans when they arrived in Aberdeen. If once that was identified as a area where a section that couldn't be used, that added on another 2, 3, 4 weeks to the project lifecycle. Because a new area of representative material, we had to go back to the operator had to go back to the core store, get the core looked out, which then adds on cost and time. So again, it's getting this preparation correct at the start, making sure that the process to preserve the samples was done correctly. I don't know what the history of the preserved sample is, but I'm pretty sure that was not the intended outcome from getting that preserved sample sorted out. And then to continue the evolution of CT scanning, let me see. Sorry. It should be the videos playing now. You can see on the right-hand side, this is a core from Amman that's been dual energy CT scanned. And obviously now this is put into 3D. This is quite a pebbly, rich conglomerate sandstone. So you can see by scanning that whole section through, taking out the different densities, you can see which areas would be suitable for plugging. and give you a really good, greater understanding of the internal fabric of the core. So you can imagine when you're trying to plug that and you're trying to get comparable samples for testing to make sure that you're looking at the different data sets correctly, you can see that you're probably going to be plugging through quite a lot of pebbles and higher density areas. So going back to the previous slides where you see the Salter effect across the core, you can see that the leaps and bounds that technology has come along is great. And this also, with this leaps and bounds of technology, it improves the data that you get out because you're getting a higher confidence that you're plugging correctly, you're getting the right orientation of core, you're plugging through areas where you know that you're going to get a homogeneous sample, or even when it's a heterogeneous section, you're getting samples that you're plugging in areas that you know are going to give comparable plugs. So going back to the older scans, you're getting so much more accuracy and data out of the scanning nowadays. So yeah, and that leads us on quite nicely to making sure you've got the correct orientation. One core plug does not fit all, and that is in terms of the different testing. So you can see on the right-hand side, you've got against the flow for rock mechanics. For formation damage, you're wanting to have the flow in a nice, the best practice flow zone. Cross beds are not ideal. And this is all making sure that you're plugging from the conventional, the core, you're getting a preserved section, or you're looking at 2/3 cut. So again, you're looking at any orientation for the MICP, etc. But again, I will look a little bit later on at why the trim orientation is important as well. Briefly, the dimensional ratios for the rock mechanics and scalar importance. You're looking at 2:1s. We'll talk a little bit about that in a few slides for the rock mechanics. Formation damage, it's more on the importance of comparison. 1 inch and 1.5 inch diameter samples provide the same results with our in-house research in the formation damage department. So the sample dimensions are less important. One of the things, again, I've said it a few times already, we'll talk a little bit about in more detail. It can be advantageous when you're looking at a preserved sample to take multiple 1-inch samples. And again, that might scare people in terms of ratios in length of samples. But if you're doing an extensive study for formation damage and you have limited core, maximizing the core samples taken from small areas of core is really beneficial. You're looking to get the brother and sister samples. And the more core that you have, and if it's prepped and stored correctly, then that core can be used in future applications. So you don't have to restart a program where you're having to re-clean core, you're taking cut core. You know that the core is from the representative area because it's been picked out by the petrophysicists, geologists, the engineers. And that gives you confidence that when you need to do a hotshot study in the future, you've got representative core samples available that you can just say, right, don't need to clean, we'll knock a month off the timeline. And as soon as any of the other dependables are ready, we can just get straight on to doing the study and get the results as quickly as possible. So again, we're going to talk again about how something doesn't suit all. Plugging medium does not suit all. You can air plug and gas leg. Mineral oil as a plugging medium does not interact with clays. Formation brine, if it's correct, matching the downhole brines shouldn't interact with the clays. However, fresh water is a big no-no. Fresh water will react with the clays. It can wet the clays and swell the clays. And therefore, if you're doing any studies where you're looking at maybe in trapped water, or you're looking at potential fines migration, or you're looking at the interactions of a drilling fluid with a core sample, you've already damaged the core prior to testing. So any damage that is any impact that the core is going to experience in a test is going to give erroneous data because you've already damaged the core. It's not virginal anymore. So that's a big no-no. One of the things that we do a lot, and I was talking about that with the unconsolidated core that I had to drive to a CAT scanner, that was frozen. So the in situ fluids in that core were used to maintain the structure and the integrity of the 3-foot sections. We then freeze the different sections in liquid nitrogen and then plug using liquid nitrogen as a medium. Now, we know from, again, in-house with our cryogenic SEM facility, that when you flash freeze the samples, the clays and the internal fabric of the rock are not damaged if done correctly. So again, when you're looking at taking core and then preparing and getting ready for plugging, we need to understand at the beginning of a project what is the best way to make sure that the core cuts correctly and not damaging. You don't want to go and plug core and think, oh yeah, we'll just air plug it, and then when you've air plugged it, the material is more unconsolidated than expected, and then you've ruined a preserved sample, or you ruined a 3-foot section because the core material's just collapsed. There's got to be an understanding of and a foreplanning and foresight to understand that, okay, we know that this area is going to be pretty unconsolidated, so we maybe need to look at freezing the core and handling that from well site to lab to getting plugged, and then we need to make sure that we're plugging correctly with the liquid nitrogen in the lab and set up for that matter. So again, understanding from the beginning the core process and the material is going to take into account later on as well. So a little bit on something that's relatively new, and I'll route back to talking again about the future projects, about CCUS. This is a technique from our colleagues in the US. It's sample preparation for shale, as you can see on the slides here, and it's taken for rock mechanics. It's a wire saw grinder and lathe instead of a sander drill press. Previously, when trying to take plugs for rock mechanics shale cap rock strength analysis, there was only a 20% success rate in taking plugs. Using this new method, this method, that we now have a 90% success rate in retrieving plugs. So it's not just about perfecting previous techniques, it's about being innovative and pushing the boundaries. So as it can see on screen, it reduces vibration and heat and violent mechanical contact. So if you're drilling down with a press, it's rotating. This allows the core material to be in perfect cylinders, or as close to perfect as we can. Not every procedure is 100% accurate, but again, this is a bit of prep and some foreplanning to think, well, we need to maybe do something different in terms to get the best sample out of the material that we have. And again, just a small anecdote for a North Sea, there was some shaling material or cap rock material required for testing, and it hadn't been kept properly. The bags in the storage facility wasn't the right size for the different chunks. So you looked at the core material laid out, and you say, oh well, that seems to be fractured every 3 foot. That seems pretty weirdly natural, and it wasn't. The material had been fractured and chopped to size to fit in bags, which again doesn't give you that long-term storage material. So yeah. Thinking about now using the last few decades to plan in advance for future projects for depleted is certainly something that needs to be considered. Just a smaller move on to the rock mechanics requirements. Again, you can see that if sidewall cores are the only available, you can still prepare the samples properly for doing a rock mechanics study. So you can see by this diagram here, we can take the UCS and triaxial and Brazilian tensile out of a sidewall core. And again, using CT scans, you would get the correct orientations to do that. Tensile strength there with a ratio of 1:2. And of course, again, we're looking back and repeating that carcass material for geology, geochemistry, and other testing is important to help us understand the actual outputs of the results. We'll talk a little bit more about that again later on, but understanding and using all the different pre-study or pre-program analysis, getting that geological data is really important to help explain results at the end of the study. So planning, getting everything correct at the beginning and getting as much data out of that initial core preparation stage is vital. So they've got different variations in terms of the preparation, in terms of like mounting. Nickel conforms to sample surface irregularities. We've got PTFE and heat shrink as well at the bottom. So it's a bit of a comparison between the both. So as you can see on screen, you've got various different pros and cons for each. But I think the main point when talking about nickel and PTFE, the variations, is that if we have a program designed and it's automatically part of your core preparation procedure to mount samples in nickel, you have to understand that nickel cannot be used in electricals. So these samples that then may be going into SCAL, and again, the future planning is that those samples will then have to be unmounted and remounted. Now that might sound like a very simple process, but if you're having 60 plug study, you've got to anticipate that adds time to a project lifecycle. And again, that's similar for FD. We'd want to have the samples wrapped in PTFE. So you've got a nice core sample here with wrapped in PTFE with gauzes at the end. But another major disadvantage of having not planned for the potential electrical work in the future is that if you have slightly unconsolidated or friable cores, you have to have the sample handled extremely carefully. And even if it is handled extremely carefully, then you might have grain loss. You might have some of the diameter of the sample, like the top edge of the core, might fall off. And this will then change base data from the routine analysis that the mounting's undergone before. So again, this adds potential time, money, and delays to a project lifecycle. And it's important to make sure when these are getting planned that the timelines don't slip. So again, we're now a little bit back onto the best practices with the CT scans. Again, this is a core sample from 2015, and to be honest, you can see a small amount of features and some low and high density areas, but looking at the CT scans, the modern CT scans now that you get, you can quite clearly see flow paths, different areas of density, and then on the right-hand side here, you can see that the sample's been plugged with the correct orientation for the maximum flow. So again, just highlighting the evolution and showing the difference that including the CT scanning can make. And again, we're going back to this whole sample here. You can see that we take the plug from there. You can then see that it's been correctly orientated. You can see a nice PTFE wrapped sample. But again, with the higher resolution, we can now see if we were to move this slightly over to the side and we take multiple samples from these different areas, you know that you're capturing samples from the same zone. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the formation damage example I have later on, where we've got real life examples of a study that was done. But making sure that you're getting the brother and sister samples correct. If you didn't do the CT scanning and didn't have this high resolution as per the 2015 examples, if you take a sample from there, a sample from there, and a sample from there, the top, middle, and bottom, you're potentially going to have wildly different samples. And that's all just from a small section of the reservoir. And when that then can provide you with maybe this area here could be 400 millidarcy, this area here can be 100 millidarcy, and this area here can be potentially, I'm just going to make this up, 600 millidarcy. And you won't be able to compare two fluid systems with those different cores, even though they are from the same preserved section. So what we're talking about in the next slide is cleaning. Now, the cleaning can take anywhere from 1 week to 4 weeks to 6 weeks. And then you measure the parameters once the samples have been cleaned. So if you've not taken the samples from the correct areas using the CT scanning and the visual observations from the geologists, then you restart that program by a month. Say you have to then retake the core, go back and replug the preserved section, and then reclean it. So you've added an extra month onto a month and a half onto the project lifecycle. So once you've taken those core samples, you've got what's the best cleaning method, and we've highlighted in green our preferred method, which is a total immersion sock slip. You can see I won't read through all the examples and the advantages and drawbacks. It's on screen, but the major point about getting the cleaning correct is again back onto the clays. You can see in the diagram here, we've got lots of filamentous illite coating a grain here. Now, we know from experience, and as we all know, that filaments are extremely fragile. So doing a post check with an SEM, which we'll show another example before, it's really important to understand that you've not damaged any of that clays or any of that virginal material in the core. And that's really important and maximized with the total immersion sock slip cleaning. So trims, planning for the destructive testing. Not only are we using the core, the importance of the core for the actual lab testing, such as relative permeability, formation damage in terms of production or injection. We also want to understand and help us explain results using trim material. I've taken the diagram from before, but this is a major little diagram in terms of explaining that trim then represents that plug. It should do. It should represent the plug. We'll look at that in a second. But making sure that you've got representative material for the plugs that you're doing allows you to perform the destructive testing at the beginning of the study. It allows you to generate thin section, SEM, XRD, gives you the pore size distribution with MICP, clay content with the XRD, the pore throat layout with SEM, and also allows you to go back and look at that in the future if there's something maybe doesn't be done for timing purposes or budget purposes, but then there's a strange result at the end of testing that needs explained. If you've got that material saved for maybe different core plugs that have not been used or material that hasn't been utilized, then you can go back and reevaluate the results. You can cross-check data, and that's really important to make sure that you're not just picking trims for the samples that you're going to use in your study. You're going to take trims for every sample that you've taken, and then you don't have to re-trim samples. One of the worst things to do for diameters is if you haven't taken a trim material, you've just taken a plug, then you've got to trim down a sample, take an end off, and that shortens the sample, and then you might not have as much confidence in you might not be able to perform rock mechanics because you think CEC is more important in strength. So again, it's really important to think about what you're wanting to do in the future and what might need to be required in the future as well. So here's just an example of when trims go bad. We've got a sample here that's extremely heterogeneous. Does a trim capture the correct lithology? What is the correct lithology in the sample? You can see here from one CT scan there, you're probably looking at this area here, so you're only seeing a small area of different lithology. And you've got this corner here of a more high density area, looks like Jupiter. But you can see here, what area is this representing in terms of the reservoir? If you take a trim from here, you would have to take a sample from this area, meaning this area, the trim is unrepresentative, because 75% of this sample, or 65% of this sample is potentially this lithology, and that's potentially the lithology you want. I will point out that if other samples were available for this sample would not be used because it's not homogeneous. You've got two different lithologies and you're going to get various different saturation profile changes between this area and that area. You're probably going to have different clay content, different pore sizes. If you did MICP on a section here and you weren't thinking about the dual lithology, then you're going to have a dual mode porosity pore size network. And then if you extrapolate that to the larger reservoir, then you're potentially getting an extremely misleading result. If you take a trim from the bottom half of the sample, then you're maybe getting a more representative, but it's not representative of a plug. So the results that you get from the lab testing from the plug is not going to match up with the trim geology. So you have to be extremely careful. And again, I'm going to go talk about the importance of CT scanning and sample selection. This sample, if we had more samples, this sample would be not deemed representative to provide useful information. However, doing the scanning and the prep prior to that, you know that this sample might provide slightly different data than you expect, but you can understand the result at the end of the study and make sure that you know, well, this may be an outlier and this is why the sample is an outlier. And as Ben mentioned briefly before, we're checking the samples with the SEM to make sure that the clays are correct. And as a geologist background and from formation damage, seeing a lovely set of like clays here, we know, because these are extremely fragile, we know that this sample's not damaged. So again, it's making sure that the prep, the understanding of the core material, the process and checks throughout the process is correct. So as I was talking earlier on, that I would funnel on to, this is a study from the North Sea, the preserved samples that we were talking about earlier on. Once you've done the cleaning, you run the base data, you get the perms, the densities, the porosities, and then you move on to the formation damage study, which was in this case. So you can see, because there's a vast amount of plugs taken, so you've got the B lithology and the A lithology, slightly different depths. We're then able to pick brother and sister samples to test. And in this case, we're looking at two different types of fluid from the same vendor with slightly different formulations. So you want to give the fluid vendor the best opportunity to the operator to showcase which fluid is best. So you want to make sure that the properties of each of the samples in terms of for the formation damage are as comparable as possible. So if you flipped that and said maybe it was a vendor 1 and vendor 2, they're both going to want the same sample. So you can see here sample 3A and 5A. So you've got 3A here for phase 2 and 5A. Very similar gas perms, grain density, slightly different porosity, but you can see on the CAT scans that both of the fabric of the core are compatible. And that gives you great confidence that when you're keeping all the other variables the same, so that you've got your confining pressure, your saturation profile, you know that the geology is correct, you know that the core is plugged correctly in orientation. The only variable that's left to decide the outcome of the testing and the core flood is the fluid that's applied. And you can see that from the second lithology, the B lithology. Again, you've got extremely comparable samples. So you have complete confidence that the variable is just the fluid or the test output. If you're wanting to compare maybe something else, then you've got a high level of confidence because you've done your background checks. I didn't put the XRD on, but or the SEM, but you can check that as well to make sure that the clays are correct. You know you've got the same geological rock type. The final bit on preparation is making sure that you're matching the reservoir conditions as well for the start of a test. You've got flooding, centrifuge, and porous plate. Each have got their own advantages on screen. As you can see, I'm just conscious of the time. Centrifuge for formation damage is excellent to get the saturation done properly. Porous plate, great for batch sample saturation. High confidence in the distribution of the sample, but it does take a little bit longer. Centrifuge is quite quick. Flooding is quite quick, but again, you're looking at potential different saturation profiles at the various ends of the sample. So, not planning in advance. Now, this is not a real life example, but it's something that we've seen many times. So you've got an example Gantt chart on the right-hand side of the screen. So you can see core is received, it's plugged and cleaned. We've only taken one plug. We've done some of the before test analysis, and then we've done the core flood, and you've got the results reported here. It'll be fine. There's only one test needed. We only need one plug. That is not true. Due to maybe the cost cutting at the start of the project, you only want to cut one plug. Then, unfortunately, it's a bit of a snakes and ladders situation. the results were not what you were expecting. You maybe damaged the core more than you had hoped. You have to get a reformulation, the fluid contracts changed, and you've had to restart. So it's reverse snakes and ladders. We've had to go all the way from getting the results reported to basically starting the project again. And then you can see here, instead of like a 1.5 month to get the initial results without the post-test analysis, you've then started into a 4-month-long project. So getting the prep, the right amount of core samples, backup core samples, understanding everything is really important to make sure that the timing of the projects is what the client and yourself needs. And I've stolen this from Jules's webinar last week. So we're not talking about full diameter core versus sidewall core here. We're talking again about the distribution of having the right amount of core samples for a study. If you've only got 1 or 2 samples and you're having to re-put these samples through different testing, again, that elongates the project life cycle. If you have taken as many plugs as you know that you need and backup plugs for any future analysis, you can see that the timeline is 32 weeks versus the 65 weeks as well. So again, this is real life examples of making sure that you have enough core material, you've planned your project and planned the study in advance, you've made sure that the core preparation is done correctly. So just to finish off, planning projects in advance, getting the core prep correct, understanding the advantages and disadvantages of the different core material, i.e. nickel versus PTFE, making sure that the core is cleaned correctly, making sure that you've scanned the core, you understand where the core samples are being taken from, the orientation is correct, all makes the project and the future applications so much easier. It allows the projects to be completed on time and gives you confidence in results, and also saves you money and makes you money. Again, if you've been attending webinars or had presentations from us before, these 2 images will be very, very familiar. But you get the preparation wrong in a SCAL project, then you're maybe overestimating or underestimating the volumes of in situ hydrocarbons. In a formation damage project, if you haven't cleaned the sample properly or for long enough and understanding how you've cleaned it, then you might get a really good result. You might get only 5% damage, and you think, oh well, that's livable. But the actual fluid that you've applied, say a drilling mud, might have damaged the core by 40%, but you've cleaned some of that permeability up because there's been salt precipitate that's not been cleaned out during solvents. So at the end of the day, then you have a disaster downhole. You say, why did that not work? So yeah, quality and accuracy of core preparation, understanding the correct methodologies to do it, allows you to get value and potential profit at the end of the study. So without further ado, thank you very much for listening today. And as mentioned before, any deep dives or any webinar sessions for yourselves or your colleagues, please get in contact with us and we can tailor and chat about arranging something for you in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Leigh. Thank you very much. We have 2 questions so far. So the first question is, can you advise if the pull-out of hole conventional core pull-ups has any effect on core recovery? So that's probably a question on tripping speed in relation to core recovery and the quality of the core. Leigh, I think you're muted.
Yes, it's not an area that I have a great experience in terms of well site, but yes, I believe from one of Jules's webinars from the previous series or one of the internal webinars, if you're pulling out quickly, then you might have gas expansion that might cause some fracturing or expansion of the core coming out. So I think trip speed, and again, I'm not an expert in this. We can get back to you on that via email. I believe it does have a major impact on the core coming out and potentially causing disruption to the core before it's even been taken out of the barrel.
So just to let everyone know, I did put an answer to that which is basically what Leigh just said, that there are various factors that will impact what sort of pull out of hole rates you can, or what tripping speeds you can use. And those would be various factors, including the volume of gas present, and that could be actual gas if it's a gas field, or the gas-oil ratio if it's an oil leg, the bubble point of the gas in the oil leg, the porosity of the sample, the permeability of the sample, any mud cake formation around the core, any stand or wait times, the rock strength itself, and various others. But these are all things that we could take into account, and we can calculate optimal POH rates.
Thank you, Jules. Okay. Leigh, we have another question. Thank you for the excellent presentation. We need to, why we need to use TPA, which is the alcohol for plugging if we are already using liquid nitrogen. Is there any specific benefit? What if it reacts with reactive clays?
Okay, that can be used for gas leg plugging. If you're using unconsolidated, it's just another option for a different methodology that can be used. It's a different methodology that can be used in terms of plugging.
It's not used alongside freezing. No. You would either freeze, or you use, if you think freezing is going to cause issues and damage because you're not able to freeze quickly enough. It's an alternative method, and it doesn't have to be TBA to be as alcohol. It could be a slightly long chain hydrocarbon, something like icosane, where it's a hydrocarbon and won't impact the clays.
Okay, thank you. So another question is about the cleaning the plug sample that's going to be used for formation damage study. Is there a specific instructions or another material or solvent other than toluene? The plug cleaning for formation damage studies.
Yeah, there's you can use a mix, which is a mix of different solvents and methanol as well. So there's various different mixes of solvents that can be used. Obviously, the major point is making sure that the samples are clean. So checking to see if the solvents are still having any precipitate still present. So you're checking for salt content in the solvents. But doing a methanol in a mix is the preference to doing the cleaning for a formation damage study, yes.
Okay, thank you. So another question is, does the lab have experience ambiguous results in electrical properties measurement by using a less optimum plug dimension, shorter length? So I think the question is, does the length of the plug affect the electrical measurements?
I think I'll pass that one on to Jules.
Yes.
Yeah, for the scal point.
So what we're determining in the electrical response, first you get the resistance, which is dimensionless, and then you convert that into resistivity as a multiple of area divided by length. So with all types of measurements, the error or the uncertainty becomes a function of the scale that you're using. So the shorter and shorter the sample, you're dividing a number by then a smaller and smaller number. And the potential error, with all becomes larger, because the potential, if the error, let's say the error is 0.02 millimeters, sorry, not centimeters, 0.2 millimeters, then the shorter and shorter the sample, if that error is not changing, then the error becomes a larger and larger percentage of your actual measurement. So it all depends on the acceptable error. But as you decrease the length, you increase the uncertainty in the measurement.
Okay, thank you, Jules. Okay, that's all the questions that was submitted in the Q&A and the chat section. If anyone has a question, please let us know. I think we just received another question. Here we go. So another question is, what are the recommended solvents for different types of rocks?
What is the recommended solvents for different types of rocks? Again, I'm going to talk completely on a formation damage point of view, with a bit of mix and a bit methanol for the sandstones, and very comparable with the carbonates as well. So yeah, I think the immersion cleaning rather than the solvents can be important with the temperatures as well. So yeah, I think with the cleaning solvents, again, we've got that mix that we combine with the 3 different types of solvent, and then also with the methanol cleaning as well. So that would be recommended for that.
Okay. So another question is, could you please elaborate on the recommended total immersion soft slit cleaning method?
Okay. I don't think I've got a good image on that. What we'd probably want to do on that one is I think there's some slides that we have from a different topic, where a different webinar where we can have a little bit more in-depth discussion on the different types and show some diagrams with the different levels of immersion. It's quite difficult to.
Yeah. So yeah, let's leave that. Then we can respond later on in writing to that question. Okay. So the next one is so for thin bed laminated reservoirs, how should sidewall cores be selected and prepared to avoid mixing multiple laminations in a single plug and to ensure the SWIR measurements represent the correct flow unit?
That's a good one. I suppose if I was to follow the theme of the webinar today, would be to make sure that you're taking as many sidewall plugs as possible for thin beds. Ideally, you'd probably want to take conventional if you're going through that, because you'll have a greater understanding of the thin bed layout, because you're capturing a whole area, a whole section, rather than just taking points, maybe 3 foot, 6 foot, whatever areas apart. I think if you go back to, I can't see who was asking the question, if they were in Jules's presentation at the beginning, the first webinar. I think that comes down to conventional versus sidewall, because with the plugging being taken at various different levels, if you're taking that 10 foot apart, you're not really going to fully understand the distribution of the thin beds with the different laminations, etc. And then you're relying on the well orientation being correct to get into that laminations with the preferential flow. So you'd want to have as much that conventional core laid out to understand that through. I mean, I was at a presentation, an AFES presentation in Aberdeen a few weeks ago about modelling that thin bed problem. I can't remember the gentleman's name that presented, because he wasn't in person, it was online because it was snow. But there was he was highlighting the importance, which we didn't talk on today, about NMR for the thin bed problem, and calibrating and making sure that that's all correct. He had his own formulation involving that. So again, in terms of the plugging, I would probably say that the conventional core versus sidewall core argument stands in there, and then making sure that you've got a lot of NMR data to tie in with the logs. Hopefully that answers the question. I'm not sure if it did.
Okay, so we have another question from the same gentleman, which is asking about the recommended preservation and handling procedure for rotary and percussion sidewall cores to ensure the SWIR we measure is not affected by mud invasion, evaporation, and wettability alteration.
Okay, that's I think I'll pass that on to Jules for the wettability alteration. Sorry, Jules.
That's okay. Sorry, I was just writing into the chat to ask people to ask questions into the Q&A rather than the chat, so I didn't catch what the question was.
So the question is, what is the recommended preservation and handling procedures for rotary and percussion sidewall cores to ensure the SWIR we measure is not affected by mud invasion, evaporation, or wettability alteration? Okay, so there is a number of things in that. In sidewall cores, the mud invasion, so SWI, we can't, the preservation is not part of, it's usually once the core is at surface. In terms of sidewall cores, there is nothing you can do to affect mud invasion, other than try to drill under pressure, rather than underbalance, rather than overbalance, and then try and persuade your drilling partner to drill under balance. I don't think you'll get that. It's really the only way to try and limit invasion. And I do say limit invasion because it still won't stop it. It will depend on the wettability. So if you're in a gas system, you will not stop filtrate loss from the mud into the formation, even under balance. If you're in an oil reservoir that is water wet and you're drilling with a water-based mud, you will experience filtrate invasion into the core, changing SWI, because it will be pulled in under wettability. So that will all depend on the balance conditions, and it would have to be extremely controlled process to acquire sidewall cores trying to limit mud invasion. The best way of ensuring SWI is with a proper core, not with rotary. With a proper core, you can use a low invasion coring head. The core is captured inside a barrel, which protects it from the majority of the mud system. You could use sponge coring or gel coring as well, where the sponge or the gel are also further limiting the potential access of mud to the core. So all of those things are limiting mud invasion. You cannot limit it with sidewall cores, either rotary or percussion, doesn't matter. Once it's at surface, then the preservation would be exactly the same as any other core. It's trying to seal it from the atmosphere, and there are various ways that we've discussed those in other webinars. So yeah, please refer to our other webinar series and review some of those processes. Thank you,
Jules. I think so, one of the very first ones we did is coring is not boring.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Jules. So one final question. I realize there's more questions that are in the chat box as well, but they're very scale heavy. So we'll try and answer them in writing later on. We're just going to focus on the topic of the webinar for today. So our final question today is, how does the core storage condition for dehydrated cores impact core preparation plugging at the plugging stage?
A lot. We were recently kicking off a formation damage project for North Sea, and the core, the slab core and the 2/3 core had not been preserved correctly. There was an abundance of core material. There's been many studies performed on that core before, so a lot was pre-plugged at the time, and we're talking 70s, 80s. I think it was 1978. So this is maybe the only time I'll really criticize geologists, being one myself, but there was a lot of spray had been put on, water had been put on the core to look at the clays in the past. So that core, or not the clays, but the lithology for descriptions, and that had buckled the core material. Again, for another study as well, that the core basically crumbled and dehydrated. So we wouldn't have been able to get any suitable plugs from that because it was all friable and fractured. And that was pretty disappointing in terms of the storage. It hadn't been stored properly in the air conditioning. And the material was just not very well preserved. So what was very lucky in that situation was that there was some immersed in oil plugs and carcass that we could take out and re-clean and plug again. And that study will be going ahead with that actual plug. So yeah, I mean, dehydrated samples that are not preserved properly in a core store, at first value are very unlikely to be suitable. You can do what we were recommending in some of the slides there. I was looking at the core under SEM. You'll be able to see whether the core is degraded. We have had an instance where the core had some mold in it, and that was seen in SEM. So if that core absolutely had to be used, you can still check to see if it's suitable. There is other options in terms of using standard cores where you mimic the pore network or the pore size and the permeability. But yeah, it's really important to make sure that's preserved properly. And yeah, it can really affect the viability of a study. You want to use the reservoir core to get the best possible results, the most realistic. There are other options to do in using analogs or slightly analogs. I mean, as in terms of a quarried core that's cut. You can use potentially core from a different well that might be deemed analog, but that's where you'd want to make sure that you've taken your XRD, your SEM, your MICP, all this material that you understand what the reservoir makeup is, the clay distribution, the whole rock, MICP, the pore throat size. And then if you go and take that and say from a well that's newly cut, and you say, well, that analog for an older system is actually very similar. It might be from a different offset well, but that you can take that information and say, well, you know, we're a few different percentage out in the total clay contact, we're a few different percentage out in the whole rock. The clay distribution around the pore throats is comparable. The permeability is much and such the same. And if you understand that at the beginning of a project, rather than saying this is absolutely 100% representative, then you know that you're getting close to the correct results from that. So yeah, really important to make sure it's preserved and everything's preserved properly in the core store. And I know that Kareem has been involved in some projects with us in helping design and looking at the best way for looking after core and core stores. So further questions on that in the future, I would direct you to our own Mr. Kareem.
Okay, thank you, Leigh. Thank you very much. So thank you all for joining us today. I think it was a great session. Thank you, Leigh. For any questions that haven't been answered, especially the scale heavy ones, we'll get back to you in writing. Okay. You will receive a link to the webinar recording, and then obviously feel free to join our to log into our YouTube channel and view all our previous recordings as well. The next session is going to be on the 13th of January, which will be delivered by Dr. Harry Rowe. The title is Facts, Fiction, Fantasy, and the Future of ED XRF in Geocharacterization. That's an amazing presentation on high resolution XRF characterization of cores, especially thin-bedded and thinly laminated cores. Okay. Thank you very much for your time with us today, and we hope to see you all very soon. Follow our LinkedIn page for updates on our webinar. And as I said, the next session is on the 13th of January next year. So hopefully see you all next year as well. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you very much.